Hello, and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's transatlantic conversation in the series Resilience and Adaptation 2.0, organized by 1014 and the American Council on Germany. With this series, we want to revisit some of the topics we discussed during the COVID-19 pandemic to evaluate which of the trends we observed proved to be sustainable.
And I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. One of the topics that we've come back to repeatedly in this series has been the future of work and how we can prepare for changes in the workplace. And today we look forward to exploring this topic again. We've been finding that the world of work is undergoing an unprecedented period of change and transformation driven by technological advancements as well as external factors. Things like globalization, demographic trends, technology, and even the environment are all having an impact on today's labor markets, and they are likely to shape the labor markets of the future. Although membership has been in decline, trade unions are often on the front line of efforts to find innovative responses to the myriad challenges of structural change. And in recent years, we've heard a lot about the transition to a green economy, but very few people have focused on the development of a quote or so-called just transition strategy as proposed by global labor unions. And so today we'd like to try to talk about how trade unions respond to global trends and geopolitical developments. We're going to explore the new global labor movement, and we'll also talk about the scope of a just transition as labor unions have mapped it out and what they can do as we try to move toward a more green economy, which is both environmentally and socially sustainable.
Here with us to discuss these developments and to continue the conversation we started together already in the summer are two renowned experts with tremendous experience in their field. Thorben Albrecht, Policy Director of IG Metall and former State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Herzlich willkommen, Thorben. Dankeschön, dass du hier bist.
Yeah, thank you for having me again on this conversation.
And of course, Dr. Annelise Orleck, Professor of History at Dartmouth College.
Hi.
And it's so nice to have you back. Thanks for joining again.
It's nice to continue the talk.
And before we get started, as always, we would like to remind everyone that the ACG and 1014 are both independent, nonpartisan organizations. The views expressed during this conversation are those of the two experts. Also, if you'd like to ask questions, as Steve said, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Let us know who your question is directed to, and we will do our best to integrate your question into the conversation.
So the last time we talked, we didn't really have time to discuss the role of trade unions in shaping the future of work or to explore whether there's a new global labor movement. And so we'd like to make up for that today by starting with these topics. And Thorben, I'd like to start with you. As policy director at IG Metall, the dominant metal workers union and the largest trade union in Germany, can you sort of in broad brushstrokes talk to us a little bit about the role of unions in Germany as we really come away from the pandemic, but as we face a host of new geopolitical and global challenges?
Yes, and I'd like to sort out some ideas about this, because I think, of course, the pandemic is more or less gone, but crises and crises are still there and even more around. And talking about the Ukraine war, talking about the war in the Middle East currently, but also technology is developing further, and I will go back to that later. And at the same time, we see in both the US and in Germany inflation rising, or at least prices still not back to levels we had before the inflation. So there's a cost of living crisis for a lot of workers, working families. And all this adds up to a lot of insecurities. And I think that is where trade unions come in at the moment, at least for Germany. When we have been struggling to attract new members during the pandemic because we couldn't go to the workplaces in the usual way, etc. We can see now that both IG Metall and the second largest union, which is active in the services sector, Verdi, are gaining new members. And I think one reason for this is that insecurities are around, and people turn to people they can trust to lead them and help them through these insecurities. First of all, of course, with wages, and there have been a lot of wage negotiations, collective agreements in Germany, which have been rather successful and have been softening the price increases we've seen. But then in a mid and longer term perspective, also helping workers in the insecurities they face, because with the greening of the economy, workplaces are changing with new technologies. And we've been talking about remote work a lot after the pandemic, but now we're seeing that new forms of generative AI are also very strongly affecting workplaces in this insecurities and shaping change in a way that workers do not fall behind, but they can also profit from these new developments, and their fears can be diminished. I think their trade unions do play a role also in the midterm, and maybe we can talk about that in detail later. But we see that trade unions are rather becoming stronger in Germany at the moment.
So Thorben, I'd like to come back to some of the issues that you touched on, like generative AI, a little bit later in the conversation. But right now, I'd like to maybe unpack a little further this notion of insecurities. Right, there's a lot of insecurity that's affecting individuals, that's affecting the workplace. It's great to hear that people are showing more interest in unions, and certainly in both countries we've seen some strikes, and we've seen the role of some trade unions. How do you feel unions are represented in policy debates? Maybe starting with you, thinking about Germany, where that's the case, and then we can come over to the US.
I think in both countries, but I can talk more about Germany. Trade unions also are becoming a stronger role in the policy debates. There are a lot of trends we are discussing with the government when it comes to AI, when it comes to new technologies, when it comes to overcoming the current insecurities around price increases. We have been also very active that there have been price breaks on energy prices, that there has been support measures for weaker families and lower income groups. But we are also involved when it comes to in which way future trends like greening the economy are shaped. And I think workers' voice is heard through trade unions there. Sometimes we go together with business on certain issues, and sometimes we present our interests also in contrast to what the business community says. But I think trade unions in Germany traditionally do have a voice when it comes to shaping policies, but increasingly so during the crisis. There have been a lot of roundtables where trade unions have been invited by the government to discuss and also present our solutions to the current problems.
Thank you, Thorben. Annelise, how is what Thorben is saying sort of resonating with you, right? I mean, here in the US, we're seeing a lot of the similar kinds of pressure, whether it be AI and technological change, but also some of the inflationary trends that are really putting pressure on workers. How do you see the role of unions playing out here in the US at this time?
Well, there's unquestionably been a surge of union activism in the United States in the last few years. I mean, it really began, I'd say, in 2012 with the beginnings of the living wage movement and service workers organizing in places like Walmart and the big box stores. So it's a good solid decade, and we're onto the a kind of new generation of organizing. What we saw this summer were some historic victories by large unions. United Parcel Service strike, the United Auto Workers strike, and the Hollywood actors, the Screen Actors Guild strike, as well as the Writers. Screen Actors Guild was also a very large strike, and in each of those cases, there were historic victories. So it feels like we're in an era again where labor can mobilize on a large scale. And, some of the victories, for example, the Screen Actors Guild, that was a strike in some ways sparked by AI, right? Mm-hmm. By the issue that most actors, as the signs on the picket line said, don't make Tom Cruise money, they're often paid by the day. What the studios were asking of them is that they were able to give them a daily fee of, let's say, about $200, and then could generate an AI version of that actor and use them again and again. And so that was one of the real sticking points in the strike. So, and in terms of the green transition, the UAW strike, the auto worker strike, definitely began to address the shift to electric cars. In markets in the United States, like California, the largest car market, or even my little state of Vermont, where in a few years, electric cars will be the only ones that you're allowed to buy new. So I think all of these changes are very much part of the labor struggle. But I don't want to leave out what is really kind of a new market for labor organizing, and that is all these small shops. And I'm thinking of the Starbucks strikes, and there was just a big one the other day. They very quickly were able to organize several hundred stores, Starbucks cafes in the United States, and this is ongoing. It's a younger generation. It's a largely college-educated generation, and so I think they're creating a new sense of where the class struggle is played out. And the third thing, in terms of, I think, labor unions shaping workplace conditions and work, is the issue of sexual harassment on the job. There have been several large McDonald's worker strikes on that issue, hotel worker strikes on that issue, graduate students who've organized unions across the United States in the last year have made that one of their major concerns. And so there you have young women, but also young men who've been subject to this, driving kind of a new conversation, I would say, in labor organizing.
So let me maybe follow up on that and sort of add that we had an opportunity to speak with the associations of employers for Germany, the Arbeitgeberverband, Steffen Kampeter. I'm sure you know him, Thorben, but also a more global association of employers. And I'm curious to what degree employers actually turn to unions for support when dealing with all of the uncertainty that we're hearing about from both of you. Do you feel that unions really have a place at the table? Maybe Annelise, can you start with that, and then we can bring Thorben back.
It's kind of a New Deal idea. Right. I mean, that was the idea that Franklin Roosevelt tried to sell, which was that the economy will run more smoothly and without as many disruptions if employers and unions work together, especially in times of economic catastrophe, as the 1930s most certainly were. I think, another historical example, and I think we are beginning to have some employers look in that direction, but just let me for a second give the historical example and then come back to the present. That historical example was the rise of Las Vegas and service workers unions. It's true in the New York hotel industry as well. There, hotel management was happy to deal with unions because it kept the cash flowing, right? And it kept the tourists coming. They didn't want to strike. Obviously, in Las Vegas, they used, in the early days, rather coercive methods to make sure there were no strikes. But I think there is that precedent. Now, it's a little harder to know. I mean, I think the Screen Actors Guild strike and the UAW strikers forced employers' hands. I don't think they wanted to deal with unions, but in the UAW strike, for example, the union said, look, when these companies were in danger of going out of business during the 2008 recession, we took cuts, right? We took cuts in our pensions. We took cuts in our other benefits. We took cuts in salaries. Now you're making great profits, especially during the pandemic, and we want to get some back, of what we lost. So there are historical precedents for what you describe. There's still a lot of resistance to employers working with unions in in the United States, and we see it everywhere, including my own campus, where you know the other factor is the rise of a legal practice of law firms that specialize in advising employers on how to break unions. And there are many corporations and many universities that spend a fortune on those union busting firms rather than just sitting down in a spirit of cooperation. I think that's the US. You're nodding, Thorben, but I'm assuming that Germany is a little friendlier to unions on the management side.
The nice
Well,
segue.
generally speaking, yes. We have this tradition of what we call Sozialpartnerschaft, so social partnership. So the normal case really would be that unions and employers talk to each other, that there are collective negotiations, that workers are very much involved in what's happened really on the shop floor when new technologies are introduced. Works councils do have a say. We, in larger companies with more than 2,000 employees, we sit on supervisory boards of these companies from the union and workers' side. So I think the tradition culture is quite different from the US. Having said that, there are single companies that are trying to use union busting technologies and techniques and involve law firms to keep unions from negotiating. So I think it's a rather mixed picture. But especially in the current situation, there have been some, I think, two trends that have been rather in favor of getting unions and employers together. One has been a measure by the government during the inflation, saying if in a collective agreement or otherwise there are one-off payments paid by the employer to the workers, they will be tax-free. And that was very attractive for the workers because it didn't increase the level of wage for a longer period, or so it was just for the moment. It was a one-off payment, very attractive for workers because they got this extra not having to pay taxes for that. That was rather short-term. But we can also see some long-term trends in some sectors where there have not been collective agreements in the past, that have been in certain trades and parts of construction work, not the large companies, not the large construction site, but rather smaller firms. There we can see that due to labor shortages, especially skilled labor shortages, some employers associations or business associations are now turning to unions and say, we want to have collective agreement because this gives us some security and it's good for our employer branding. We can then find more easily workers for our companies. So there are some trends that are supporting business to get into closer talks with us. Also, when it comes to new technologies being introduced, as I just said, but there are counter trends as well in Germany too.
So, some of what both of you are talking about really transcends national boundaries in terms of the challenges. And so I'd be really curious to hear from each of you what your take is on whether there is a global labor movement at this point, or whether the distinctions are sort of too focused on the national level. Annelise, I know that this is something that you've spent a fair amount of time thinking about and working on. Can you talk a little bit about what you're finding when it comes to a global labor movement and the contours of that?
Well, there definitely is a lot going on. I mean, I would defer to Thorben, who's right inside the labor movement, as to what you're thinking. But, certainly what I found in the last few years, talking to people around the world, is that there's very much of a global labor movement. And some of it is happening through international cooperation. And we saw in 2013, 14, 15, 16, for example, these global one-day strikes in the fast food industry that were made possible by not only transnational capitalism, but also by social media, right? And so people could communicate from the ground up using their phones, and also that's a way that information passes national boundaries about wage structures. So I interviewed a Bangladeshi garment worker organizer who talked about how when Cambodian workers raised their wages by 4 times, in their minimum wage struggle, she would see people on the floor of the factory with their phones, right, looking at the videos of the Cambodian workers' celebrations and understanding how much they made, and that definitely sparked their organizing. There are also transnational campaigns around, for example, as I mentioned, sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace. And there's an attempt by the International Trade Union Confederation under Shannon Burrows, but also the International Domestic Workers Federation to get a United Nations and an ILO convention, zero tolerance for sexual violence in the workplace. So those have brought people together in unions around the world. The ITUC, which I mentioned earlier, is very involved in enslavement of workers, for example, in the Gulf state countries, where the majority of workers there, of people who live there, have come from other countries, and people find themselves having their passports taken away and being held in bondage, both construction workers and domestic workers. And so ITUC has been involved in that, but also on the ground level up, workers have been communicating. I just wrote an article that'll come out sometime in the spring about an international organizing effort among Filipino overseas domestic workers who are in hundreds of countries around the world and are now seeking to organize together. So I think there's very much of a global labor movement. I mean, there was always that internationalist rhetoric in the labor movement, but technology makes it easier now, I think, to keep that going in more than an annual convention kind of basis.
Mm-hmm. And Thorben, do you see that as well from your perspective?
Yeah, I think all what Annelise said, I can only underline, and then I would add just 2 more trends. One is that there are certain issues around for nearly every trade union, and one definitely is technology, and that is not limited to Western countries. So issues around technology, how it's used on the workplace. Some of the new platforms we're looking at are not just locally. I mean, food delivery is, but coding, which is given over a platform globally. There are new global labor markets also through platforms in certain areas. So looking at that and exchanging views about that, I think that is increasingly happening, even if the organizing might still be done nationally there, but the exchange, I think, is very much growing. And a second trend we can at least see in Germany and Europe is that both from the legal side and from the capital market side, the issues around sustainability criteria is growing. Due diligence law has been introduced in Germany that makes sure that in the supply chain certain environmental but also labor standards are not been undercut, and the European Union is just working on a due diligence directive, which would then bring that to the whole of the EU. And I think this is a new field of work also for trade unions. There have been some international framework agreements, as they're called, inside companies where trade unions from all over the supply chain try to make sure that labor standards are not infringed. But with this new legal framework, and also with capital markets looking at this kind of criteria when financing companies, this gives some leverage to trade unions to look further into the supply chain. And that, of course, means working together with local trade unions where they exist in countries also in the global south, or working to build up these kind of structures very often with NGOs. So this is a new field also for trade unions to work together along supply chains and inside international corporations.
Let's maybe turn our attention to something that's also happening globally, and that is the green transition. And you've mentioned it before in various parts. And of course, when we talk about what's going on globally right now, today COP28 in the United Arab Emirates is starting right now. So it's a global concern of how do we pivot towards a more sustainable green economy. Annelise, you talked about a New Deal moment, and Thorben, you talked about Sozialpartnerschaft. Everyone should be sitting at the table, and I would think the green transition, that's such a humongous and complex endeavor that's probably a topic where definitely everyone should be sitting at the table. Thorben, you said, the green transition is necessary as it is. It's affecting and adding to insecurity that you laid out in your opening statements. And Annelise, you mentioned the automaker strike, the shift to EVs, and all the insecurity of that comes along with that. Thorben, I would like to draw the attention to an article in the Financial Times that you contributed to, with the headline, "Net zero was never going to be an easy win for workers." So can you just explain a little bit about what in the green transition might not be playing out for workers, and what is it that could be not so easy?
Yeah, I think that there are different challenges in different sectors. You have sectors where the old jobs completely will disappear. In Germany, for example, in mining and coal mining, which is phasing out. So there have been some arrangements found there that people either can go into some early retirement schemes, or they get the possibility to reskill into new jobs. There are other sectors that are changing profoundly within themselves without necessarily jobs getting lost. That could be the car industry when turning to EVs. But there again, for the cars of the future, you will need less mechanic workers and more software engineers, because computers in cars to play a much more prominent role. So here again, we have questions of reskilling. There are, of course, growing sectors, like, for example, in the heating industry, where new technologies are introduced into buildings. But in Germany, at least, they are not as good paid as traditional manufacturing jobs. So we have issues around here. And one sector I also mentioned in this FT article you've been quoting, which I think is very interesting, is the steel sector in Germany, because there the production will change from producing steel by using coal to producing steel. We're talking about original steel here, not recycling, by using hydrogen. Maybe gas in between, but then hydrogen. And we all know that the number of workers you need for the same amount of steel will be less than it is today. And we have a very good organized workforce there. So now we're going into a collective bargaining round in the steel sector in Germany, where my union is not only demanding short-term wage increases, which of course are necessary in times of inflation, but also for a shortening of the working hours. We already have 35 hours now in the steel industry, and we want to come to 32 hours in the future, to come to a 4-day working week, because we know that with this we can, on the one hand side, make sure that people are not losing their jobs in the steel industry. So the number of jobs will be kept, even though the working time is reduced. And at the same time, also, it's a demand that we can see around workforces in Germany, that people are demanding to reduce working time, because increasingly also men are willing to take over more responsibilities when it comes to care work. So more equal distribution of care work between men and women would be possible with a 4-day work week. Also some positive ecological effects, because commuting will be reduced. So I think there are a lot of ideas around this reducing working time. And when you have a situation where the volume of work needed in the industry is decreasing, we think this is a good idea then to demand and go for shorter working week, which could be an element to shape in a way the green transition in this specific sector in the steel industry.
Thank you so much. We actually have a viewer question that I'd like to fold into the conversation right now. So the viewer said, Thorben, you mentioned shorter work weeks, which has been a huge conversation in Germany. And the viewer would like to know, what would that look like in the United States? Is that something, people here, unions or employers are discussing as well? Or are there other mechanisms sort of to make this a smooth transition? And I don't know who, Annelise, do you want to take that?
I mean, I don't hear a lot about it. I think it's certainly a conversation that people are having, and but on a policy level, I'm not seeing a ton of conversation about shorter work weeks. What I am seeing is an increasingly common policy about unlimited paid time off. And a lot of newer corporations are offering their employees that. And it's not the same thing, because you can only get the time off when, you're able to clear the tasks off your desk or off your, whatever, your workbench. But I think that's the only thing I'm hearing that's, in line with the whole idea about a shorter work week. But certainly it's being discussed. I see articles about it. Yeah, we'll see.
Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
If I had it correctly, the United Auto Workers in the US have been also demanding shortening of working times in the strikes they had. They did not succeed, but I think they planted this debate also in this sector in the US. So I think, and everything I was talking about, we are not talking about introducing it 1st of January next year, but I think it's very interesting as a midterm perspective, and maybe that could be also the debate, at least in the US, and then we will see how far we get with that. But I think the discussion is around because there are so many issues, as I said, also about societal questions that are can be combined with the shorter working weeks. And especially, I think, if we talk about the green transition, we very often, in Germany at least, talk about what we cannot afford any longer, where we have to limit ourselves. And I think also for securing the support for green transition, it would be very helpful to have some positive debates that this is also a change to the better, to better lives, and not only saying, well, we cannot travel any longer, we cannot do this, we cannot do that, but there should be some gains visible for people in their everyday lives. So I think from this point of view, also a discussion about shorter working week and more time for family, for friends, also for civic engagement would be good for our democracies if more people would be active there too in both countries. So I think maybe not as a short-term objective, but as a societal debate around the green transition and where we want to end up with this. I think that this is a very important debate.
And I think the green transition is something that the stereotype is that the stereotypical union guy, in the Rust Belt of the United States is anti-green transition because those are not union jobs. And, so I think, in terms of policy to support the green transition, that's where unions really have to be brought in to the discussion, so that, in fact, the transition to EVs, for example, is one that's made with union jobs. And, the resistance of people like Elon Musk to, having unionization in his plants, has to be, I think, addressed head on if, for example, the Biden administration really wants to push forward with this transition. The other issue which has come up, and I appreciated your comment, Thorben, that it's not going to be easy for labor in any way, is both the environmental and labor consequences of mining for lithium and cobalt that's necessary for the EV transition. And, clearly EVs are coming, and other kinds of fuel burning cars are coming. And, I think it's an opportunity for labor to jump in and say, we want to be talking to, environmentalists at COP28. And I know there are labor leaders at COP28, as there have been each year. And we want to be addressing this question of, child labor and environmental catastrophe in the mining of the minerals that are necessary for electric cars and other electronics.
I'm just talking about a little bbit about this anxiety maybe amongst workers, sort of to pivot to a green transition and or the communication about it. So I hear a lot, the path to net zero is paved with jobs, so which was probably an attempt for policymakers to try and be reassuring about it. But when I listen to you, I also hear the optimism. I hear that unions should be involved, should seize that opportunity. But I also hear about the need to reskill, of course, and since we move, from manufacturing jobs to other types of jobs. And this is on a spreadsheet. It's probably easy to shift like people from one sector to the other. In reality, it's probably a little bit more difficult, and you have demographics, you have geographical differences. So how does that play out, like on the ground? Are people willing to take up this challenge? Are people willing to move? Are people willing to continue training, to reskill? What's the fear?
Well, I think in Germany, our experience is that people's willingness to move longer distances is not very, very great. And I think it's also for the geographics of our countries, it's important that we don't leave regions behind. So our approach is also together with the government, with regional governments, with business, to really look at regions that are especially affected because they are, for example, very reliant on producing parts for combustion engines, but we've seen the same also in regions that are heavily dependent on mining. That we really, I think, need to develop, and that is happening at least in some regions, developing new, let's call it business models for a region. What should be produced, what should be made, what kind of institutions do we need there in the future? And I think that is one important aspect. The second one is when we talk about manufacturing workers who usually don't have a university degree, for them, going to the school bench again is not something they really are very happy about. And also they have the fears, will they succeed in this? So what we've seen in Germany, there have been a lot of efforts to make reskilling possible, also to pay for it, but that is not enough either. We need really to have people talking very much with the workers, and actually we as trade unions, and we seen that in other countries too, we are trying to introduce in these kind of companies some kind of training reps, so people that are trade union representatives or even only trade union members that talk to workers about reskilling, also stay in contact in a way of coaching them through reskilling so that they don't give up halfway. So I think it's quite a difficult task actually, but one that needs to be done. And then of course we have to make sure that the new jobs that are starting there, that they are union jobs and that the working conditions work out fine. So the regional issue, the individual issue, they all play a role. So it's quite a complex path we have to walk there, but I think it's necessary if we really don't want to leave people behind.
You mentioned that the second largest union in Germany is the service workers. The rise of the service sector work and the decline of manufacturing is an important part of this story. And it's not just, it's not just that we need to reskill people, but service work is one of those kinds of work that even during and after the pandemic has to be done in person, right? You need a body there to perform the service. And I'm including in this, for example, early childhood education and the people who teach children and childcare workers. So those jobs have grown in number there. And so I think that's the other challenge. And we've been talking about it for a while, is the need. They're not paid a living wage. The hours are terrible. It's not labor that by and large we recognize the value of. It's heavily female. It's heavily immigrant. It's heavily people of color. So, I think that is another issue. Some of those sectors have become unionized. Hotel housekeepers, for example, which is actually, in the United States at least, the profession, the single profession where you're most likely to get injured and work in pain. And it, you wouldn't think of it. You think of, someone who's out there on the construction site, but just, leaning across those beds and picking up those heavy mattresses and working with toxic chemicals to clean bathroom floors, all of that has led to some very terrible conditions, as well as really endemic sexual harassment. Something like 3/4 of hotel housekeepers have been subject to it. So, I mean, I think these raise all sorts of issues for the future of work and the future of labor. And it was, it was a very ambitious policy idea for the Biden administration that he was going to start early childhood teachers at a living wage. I think it was, in the 60s, 70,000. And, that died with the resistance from more, the Republican House members. But I think these discussions need to continue. But the other piece of it, apart from, reskilling and the new transition, is that there's just all these new jobs. The only reason they make any sense to me is because I keep talking to my, my children and their friends about the kind of work that they do, and there's startups and, all of this kind of work that acknowledges, the new realities, technologically. And that's a different kind of field. And I think we really do have to move beyond thinking that, the image of labor, which is, the brawny guy in a factory, is all we're looking at. It's much more diverse, and it isn't just about, re-education or moving or reskilling. There's just a lot of different kinds of jobs on the horizon right now. And for Gen Z is when, that's the other factor. I brought it up last time, and, it's important to talk about. I think they are the biggest generation since the baby boomers, right? And they have their own ideas about work, and they are taking a lot of these new kinds of jobs and trying to reshape the way work happens. And they're also very pro-union. As one said to me, our generation didn't get the memo that unions are bad. We like the idea, we're joining unions. So even though the percentage of workers continues to stay stagnant, percentage of workers who are unionized stays stagnant, the numbers of workers who are unionized in the United States has grown quite a bit. And I think we're going to continue to see that.
And so here too, we're seeing an important demographic shift as well, right? Just in terms of the acceptance of unions in the US. I found it interesting to hear both of you talk about this from a sort of social context and thinking about it in terms of quality of life, putting sort of the role of work in a broader societal framework and context. And one of our viewers asks whether a shorter working week for skilled labor, more free time for sort of social engagement without payment would be sustainable, right? I mean, is this sort of a sustainable model as one thinks about fewer work hours and more, community engagement? I'd love to hear, each of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it would be a much more sustainable way of working, and maybe one should add that at least in the German context, we also have the situation that we have a lot of workers, and especially women workers, who only work part-time and want to work longer hours because they only work like 20 hours a week or so. And that is true for 50% of women in Germany work only part-time, so a huge number. So I think when we talk about 4-day week, it would be decreased for some and an increase for others, which could contribute work also much more equally. And I think, yes, it would be both from an economic point of view, maybe even if this counterintuitive to have it in a question in a time of labor shortages, but all the sectors Annelise mentioned, hotel hospitality workers, there we can see that the first chains in Germany are turning to a 4-day work week. We can see that there's a debate in care work, healthcare, childcare, because we see a lot of people, and again, mostly women, are dropping out after a few years because working conditions are so bad. Here again, working shorter work week would help, but also I think it would lead to more to a better balance between what we do in our work life and what we do in our private life, because I see very few people who don't want to work at all and say we want to. There might be other reasons for unconditional basic income, but most of people want to work. But people want to live also. They want to care about their family, their friends, and also about society. And a lot of people feel some fatigue about not being able to be active in society. And I think this could help too. So I think it's a much broader picture than just looking at the workplace.
Yeah, and that's not a new idea, right? Bread and roses. 100 years ago, people were talking about, wanting access to, recreation time, to be able to get out into the countryside, I have testimonies from, people coming before legislatures in 1912 and 1913 saying, the working girl should be able to have enough money to buy books and have time to go to the theater. And, so, and one of those testimonies that I read from that era said something that I think bears on what you just said, which is that, it said, who's to say that, the underwear maker can't contribute more to her larger society by writing poetry than she does by, through her 10 hours a day at the sewing machine. So I think, it's not a new idea. Workers have always asked for that. But I do think, again, to come back to Gen Z, who fascinate me, I think, several of members of that generation have said to me in the last couple of weeks, we don't fetishize work. We want to work to make a living. We want to work to do things that we think are meaningful, but, we resist the workaholism of American culture. We want time off to do other things. We want work-life balance. Obviously, that's been talked about throughout, but I think in the half century of neoliberalism, it's really been, okay, profit making is where we're going and everything else is secondary. And I don't think Gen Z is there anymore. I really don't.
And I think you just, stated a common term that we all think about, right? It's that work-life balance and trying to navigate the two. Related to this, one of our viewers just submitted a question asking whether changes in patterns of employment for nurses has influenced other sectors. She's thinking specifically about longer hours, but fewer days a week, and whether that's sort of a model that you've seen work elsewhere as well. I don't know if either of you have seen an influence there or not.
Okay. For Germany, I don't, but maybe that's, I don't know where the question comes from, but we have quite strict limits on daily working hours, and for reasons of occupational health and safety. And I think we should, in general, stick to them. There might be some more flexibility possible when, on the other hand, workers get some flexibility too. But generally speaking, our model of a 4-day work week we are debating now is more about really shorter working hours. And I think, at least in Germany, everybody knows that the working conditions of nurses are not the ones most people are aiming at. So I think it's rather not a role model here. Maybe I didn't get the question completely right, but.
No, but I think that was the intent of the question, is that, here you're seeing nurses working longer hours, which is not necessarily always a good thing, right? Because it's a very stressful job as well, but they're able to work fewer days a week. And so there is that added flexibility. I think maybe a follow-on question to what you were just saying, Thorben, though, of going to a shorter work week overall, and not maintaining 40 hours a week, but on 4 days as opposed to spread over 5, but going to a 32-hour work week. In the German model, what I would sort of question is, particularly given the demographic trends of a shrinking population, how does one pay for the social welfare structure if you have people working fewer hours? Because I think that becomes a challenge as well.
That's true, but I think there's also some counter trends there. One I already mentioned is that the hope would be that workers who are now working part-time would go also from maybe 20 to 32 hours. So that would make up for a lot of the shortening of the working hours. A second aspect, of course, is the question of people are less ill, and there are less times when they drop out for illness, short term, but also for long term illnesses in a longer time. We see that a lot of people don't reach the legal pensions age in Germany, but have to stop working before, and this would also be diminished there. And then, of course, we need, and maybe that's funny for a union guy to say this, but we need automation, and we need to use new technologies. And I think this is possible not only in manufacturing, not only in office jobs, but at least in Germany, I could say what a lot of care workers in childcare, or what a lot of nurses are complaining about in their working, is not that they spend too much time with their patients, with their children, but that they have to do documentaries, that they have to write down things. And there, again, automation could help a lot. And then also that would focus the work of workers more to the things that are important to them, rather to some stupid routine work which has to be done, but which can be automated, especially with the new forms of AI. I'm quite optimistic, if used in a good way, that could really take away the stupid part of the jobs and give more time for the more important things.
I also think the nurses' schedule here, they work 3 12-hour shifts, and then have 4 days off. But as every nurse I've spoken to said, on the day after the 3 back-to-back 12s, they can't move, right? They can't get out of bed, they can't do anything. So then you have an errand day and you're left with the same weekend that everybody else has. But I think in childcare is another place you see those longer hours and those longer shifts demanded, and they're not for the purpose of flexibility for the workers. They're they're for the benefit of employers. And certainly in childcare, the reason people are willing to do it is because their hourly wage is so low that they can't afford they can't afford to support themselves on a normal number of hours. So some of it is, I think, as Thorben suggested, and you raised the issue of the welfare state, there has to be a larger reckoning, right? And there has to be a larger question, internationally and nationally, about what our priorities are. And, the welfare state has been eviscerated in this country in the last 60 years. And so I think, this time has come to have a discussion about what we owe workers, and particularly workers who I think care workers, those who care for our children and our elderly. It's shameful, right, how little they're paid and how bad the working conditions are and what kinds of long hours they work. When I was interviewing Fight for 15 activists, right, who were fighting for $15 an hour, and 10 years ago in the United States, the home healthcare workers said our Fight for 15 is a fight for 15-minute breaks now and again, right? Because we work 24-hour shifts with these really vulnerable people, and we can't get outside to feel the sun on our faces. So, I just think there has to be a larger national reckoning, and there's no question that unions can put pressure on politicians and on government, and just in generally change the public discourse on those issues.
We're starting to run out of time here, and there's so many topics yet again that I feel like we could pick up. And I'd like to maybe stick with you, Annelise, and ask you a question about essential workers, because that's basically who you were talking about just now. And I feel like they were invisible to so many people prior to the pandemic, and then suddenly our eyes were open and we saw how essential many of their contributions were. Do you think, as we put the pandemic in the rearview mirror, we still have a sense of appreciation for the contributions that these essential workers are making, or is that starting to fade as well?
I don't think we had an appreciation for it during the pandemic, right? Maybe
Really?
we talked about healthcare workers and people applauded them every day at 7 p.m. But nobody thought about the grocery workers who were forced to take the subway and go in and work face to face with people, and others deemed essential who put their lives on the line every day. And there were an unprecedented number of safety complaints to the U.S. government, but the Occupational Safety and Health Administration had been completely stripped to almost nothing. By one estimate, for all of the complaints about safety that were lodged by essential workers during the pandemic, it would have taken OSHA 166 years with its current staff to investigate. Yeah. So, again, I think they're organizing, and they did start to organize, and they did complain, and they did start to have strikes. I think those are what's getting people's attention. And but the one thing that I think is interesting is that because the view on unions shifted so much during the pandemic, I would say that maybe among some Americans, at least, there was a recognition that we should show not gratitude, but just pay a living wage. People shouldn't have to die to go to work every day, and that essential workers were forced to go. They didn't even get to make the decision, and that was very, very, very rough for a lot of people. I don't think we've begun to calculate how rough it was.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's an important insight. Thorben, as we sort of finish up the hour together, you've brought up generative AI a couple of times, and we've talked in the course of our conversation about new technologies. I'd be curious to get your take on the role that unions can play in help training workers to deal with these new technologies. I mean, obviously, this is not something new for unions. There has been new technology that's been introduced in the workplace, and unions have played a role in that. But I feel like all of us are really struggling to keep up with some of the technological advancements at the moment, particularly in the field of AI. And I'd love to hear your insights on how unions can be part of that training process.
Well, I think unions have to first train themselves about it. And that's what we're doing, actually, because, of course, as you said, the developments are so quick, and the new forms of generative AI pose new challenges in everyday life. Should workers use them or not? Some workers do to improve their work output, but in Germany, most of the time, it's not legal to do that, especially not if you give any internal data into the systems, and then you're really in big trouble. So that is something we are training the workers about. But of course, then when it's used in a proper way, there has to be some basic understanding. And I think it's there we have to have unions, but also employers and public education go together, because I think everybody in the future needs some basic understanding of AI, and that can be done only in a more general effort. There has been a very good example from, I think, Finland, where they introduced an online course about basic AI knowledge, where you actually even get a small diploma after that. And I think that is really necessary, because as I see it, but this is really very short to finish it off. But I'm convinced that this new form of AI will be a general purpose technology, like electricity was in the past. So it means everybody needs to deal with it. You don't have to be an electrician, but you need to know how to use it in your workplace. And I think that is really a huge task for training people that can be not only done by trade unions, but we need a broad approach there.
Tom and Annelise, this was such a great, comprehensive conversation again about where we're heading with the future of work. We again, as Steve said before, we've touched so many topics that we didn't even have the time sort of to hone in anymore. I'm thinking about the shortage of skilled labor, Tom, that you mentioned, or Annelise, sexual harassment incidents that are of concern and that need to be somehow dealt with in a better way than we do right now. So there's so much more. So I would suggest maybe in another a few months we continue that discussion. But for now, I really would like to thank you so much for your thoughts, your ideas on where we're heading. I do take away that, unions need to sit at the table. It is the moment for everybody to sit together. The challenges are huge, and there's only a way to move forward together. And hopefully this is what's happening and what will be happening. So thank you so much. And well, maybe we see each other again in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, Katja, Thorben. I learned a lot from you as I did the last time. Take care.
Thank you very much for excellent conversation. Thank you for having me.